And welcome to the McClellan County Public Library. My name is Nathan Lynn. I work in the Local and Family History Department here. I've seen a number of you in here, and I hope to see the rest of you come in and visit us. I'd like to start off and thank Mr. Art Farrell for getting in touch with us and Ed. Also, Bill Baxter for his help this week, and John Robertson and all the staff here, and our director, Julie Hart, and most importantly, you guys in the community for supporting programs here at the McClellan County Public Library. Without you all, we wouldn't be here tonight, so thank you all for coming out. Nestled on the edge of the confluence of the Tennessee and Ohio River, the city of Paducah also lies extremely close to the confluences of the Cumberland and Ohio rivers at Smithland and the Ohio and Mississippi rivers at Cairo. It's common knowledge that these rivers have played a dramatic role in the everyday lives of us, the inhabitants of the Jackson Purchase. And so it will be when the war between the states broke out, access to the Tennessee River and all of these waterways would play a very important role in the war. Tonight we're honored to have a very special guest here to discuss that role that we play here in Paducah during the Civil War. Mr. Ed Bars is a true national treasure. He was raised in Montana, is well acquainted with the cattle ranching. His father was a World War I veteran who read numerous accounts of battles to Ed as a child. In 1941, after graduating, Ed decided that he better hitchhike across the country and visit a number of the battlefields, including Shenandoah Valley and a number of the battlefields in that area. He served at the invasion of Guadalcanal, the Russell Islands, and the Suicide Creek. After the war, he utilized the GI Bill to receive his bachelor's from Georgetown and a master's from Indiana University. He holds honorary doctorates from Lincoln College and Gettysburg College. In 1955, he began work at Vicksburg National Battlefield, where he eventually met his wife, Margie. Also during this time, he began to give guided tours of the battlefield there and began work in rescuing the USS Cairo, which many of us are familiar with, and was documented in his book, Hard Luck Ironclad, I apologize. In 1966, he was transferred to Washington, D.C., where he continued to work for the National Park Service and would serve as chief historian of the National Park Service from 1981 through 1994. He retains the title of Chief Historian Emeritus. He has worked as a tour guide for Civil War battlefields for the Smithsonian Associates. He is the author of multiple works, including Hard Luck Ironclad, The Battle of Wilson's Creek, and most recently, Fields of Honor, Reciting Tide, Vicksburg and Gettysburg. He's featured in numerous documentaries, which many of you have probably seen. He has received numerous awards, including the Harry S. Truman Award and a Distinguished Service Award for the Department of Interior in 1983. He's a world traveler, a true American treasure, and he can outwalk probably all of us in this room. I'm very pleased to be here tonight and welcome Mr. Ed Bars.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be in Paducah. This is my third visit to Paducah. One little story on Paducah. I happened to have on a tour of McDowell. The Battle of McDowell is one of Jackson's Valley campaign, and it's very steep. And this gentleman was head of one of the biggest furniture companies in the United States. And as we get to the top of it, he reminds me of a story of Paducah. He was the president of the senior class of Washington and Lee on a noted day that would have repercussions in Paducah. It's April 30th, 1956. After serving Vice President of the United States, Alvin Barkley had decided he wanted to go back to the Senate. And he ran for election, and he was elected. So from vice president presiding over the Senate with a long service in the Senate, he's going to have a very important thing happen to him. And this fellow I have is sitting there, just about as close to me as you are. When Alvin Barkley is addressing the audience, and he is going to make these remarks. People have heard tapes that there is no sign of what is going to happen to him. And he will refer to, in his statement he's making on being reelected to Congress, and he'll allude to Psalms 84-10. And he will remark, I am glad to sit in back row, for I would rather be a servant of those of the Lord than to sit in the seats of the mighty. And he drops dead. And I visited his gravesite today out there. Well, I'm going to speak of a man who pays his first visit to Paducah of any notoriety on the 6th day of September 1861. If you would predict that in 4 short years he will be meeting with Robert E. Lee in the parlor of the Wilmer McLean house to accept the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. I would think he had gone a long way from that morning he stepped ashore here on the 6th day of September, 1861. Yulee, as his family called him, was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio, on the 29th day of April, 1822. He's just a year older than that man's figure you're wearing on you. He was born on the 13th day of July, 1821. And they're going to meet each other, but this is about Grant, not about Nathan Bedford Forrest. He will go to West Point. He gets a big break on his appointment to West Point because his family, he is known in the family as Hiram Ulysses Grant. The appointive officer, his congressman, did not get his name right. He was called Yulee at home, so he entered his name on the appointment papers as Ulysses, Yulee. Usually the oldest family, son in a family, was given the mother's maiden name, Simpson. So he becomes Ulysses Simpson Grant. Now, he graduated number 21 in the class of 1843. He was not assigned to the Corps of Engineers or the Ordnance Corps, who got the brains of the class. He will be assigned, and he's remembered for all the people at West Point during the 7 years he's there as the best horseman in the school. what do they assign him to? The 4th Infantry. He will serve in the Mexican War as a credible captain. As soon as he gets out of as the war is over, he'll marry Julia Dent Grant. They will, as President and First Lady, probably are the most devoted couple that are ever in the White House. There are not certain other presidents we know who live in the White House that are not very devoted couples. I will not mention any names. He will be sent as an officer in the 4th Infantry, as a captain, in 1851. He is too poor as a 2nd lieutenant to take Julia and their 2 children. He is an unhappy man on the Department of the Pacific, first at Fort Vancouver and then at Fort Humboldt. At the evaluation of his career for that year, in 1854, he meets with Captain Buchanan. I can think of Captain Buchanan what he said as Colonel Buchanan when this man becomes General-in-Chief of the Army. And he says, Captain Grant, I have problems with you. You drink on the job and you gamble. You have but 2 options, resigning from the Army or having court-martial charges against you. Needless to say, he resigns. Now, the Army is small at that time. Any small organization scattered from the Atlantic to the Pacific are born gossips. So any officer in the Army at that time knows why U.S. Grant resigned from the Army. It's not because he's clean living. When he arrives in New York, after coming back from California, he's dead broke. Who does he borrow money from? Simon Bolivar Buckner. He's in the class of 42. Grant's in the class of 43. And Grant tells Buckner, who is well-heeled, how about lending me money to get to St. Louis? Buckner lends him money to get to St. Louis. We'll find out how he replays Buckner at Fort Donelson. Grant has one lucky other thing at West Point. He's entered in the, as a cadet as Ulysses Simpson Grant. His name is Hiram Ulysses Grant. But he thinks, why am I going to fight City Hall anyway? When they stencil my clothes with Hiram Ulysses Grant, it's Hug. Think of what the other cadets can do with Hug Grant. It makes much better at Fort Donelson because U.S. becomes unconditional surrender Grant. Well, he will acquire 2 more children before the firing on Fort Sumter and be compelled, be a failure in the jobs he's had. And finally, with hat in hand, he goes to work for his father, Jesse, a hard-driving man anxious to get ahead in the middle class. And when he learns that Fort Sumter has been fired on, and Lincoln has called for 75,000 volunteers, he's going to think, George B. McClellan, he was a plebe when I was a graduate. McClellan had left the Army, and he's now a Major General of Volunteers, headquartered in Cincinnati. Maybe he will remember me. Yes, he remembers you well, Yulee. Yulee will catch the train down to Cincinnati, send in his calling card, and he sits all day in the office. McClellan has looked at Ulysses S. Grant. Says, I remember him well. I know why he left the Army. He then gets a no-paying job for the original Tricky Dick. There was a Tricky Dick long before Tricky Dick Nixon. That's Tricky Dick Yates, the governor of Illinois. Has some of the same habits as the later Tricky Dick. But he will work for him, and they suddenly get a regiment, the 21st Illinois. The 21st Illinois, at that time, if you're in a volunteer regiment, you elected your officers. You elected nice guys. Nice guys finished last. And the colonel of the 21st Illinois is not doing well. So they give the regiment to Ulysses Simpson Grant. So he is now a colonel of the 21st Illinois. To let him know who's boss, he marches them from Springfield to Quincy. They don't get to ride the train. Now, he will be in charge of a brigade of troops. And this is his biggest lesson and his biggest strong point. On the 11th day of August, as they advance west from Hannibal on the railroad going west across North Missouri, they come into contact with members of the Missouri State Guard, commanded by Colonel Harris. Grant, when he comes in the presence of the enemy, although he's a good captain, hasn't tested his moral courage. There are two types of courage. There's moral courage and physical courage. For a commanding officer, moral courage is more important. And as he comes in presence of the enemy, he can't order an attack. He spends a whole chapter in his memoirs. The next morning, he wakes up and the Missouri State Guard has fled. And he realizes that the other commander can be just as concerned about moral courage as he is. And he will never have trouble with moral courage again. And that's going to be very bad for the Confederates, whether they're at Fort Donelson, at Shiloh, Vicksburg, or all those battles that go before he becomes General-in-Chief. Because he never, as Sherman says, he never worries what the enemy is doing. He is thinking about what he's going to be doing. Well, he will end up on the 4th day of September at Cairo, Illinois, replacing the commander there. And it seems that some Confederates, I hate to say it in front of an audience that has forests on them, lack moral courage. And I'm talking about Bishop Polk and Gideon Pillow, which is good for Colonel Grant, who is now a brigadier general. When the Confederates occupy Hickman and Columbus on the 4th, and they hesitate to come to the largest city in the Jackson Purchase. That sends 5,400 men into the Confederate Army and a handful into the Union Army. Who comes Columbus first? And that's why I say his career upward begins here on the morning this man knows before I did, on the morning of the 6th day of September, 1861. And that's where he's going to start his rise to leadership. You almost, if you were lucky and more aggressive, and Grant had a poor horse, you would have had no more Grant after Belmont to give the Confederates trouble. Because on the 7th day of November, he fights his first battle against General Pillow, who is not one of the great generals of the Civil War. I hope none of his relatives are sitting in the audience. And in the end, Pillow has been reinforced and is winning. Grant waits till almost too late to get aboard one of the transports that's going to take him back to Cairo. Good, he's a good horseman, the best in his class at West Point. He puts the spurs to him, the horse makes a leap, he keeps in his saddle, and he is going to escape. Well, let's go fast ahead again. Now, the Confederates in the West are now led by Albert Sidney Johnston. If you think Robert E. Lee is Jefferson Davis's favorite general, think again. His favorite general is Albert Sidney Johnston. Albert Sidney Johnston was born in Washington, Kentucky. He is born in 1802. And Jefferson Davis, as all the good ladies of the UDC here know, was born in 1808. And whether he's at Transylvania or West Point, Davis admires Johnston most of all. He had served under him. And he'll send Johnston out to Kentucky in the far west and try to make something out of the troops raised by Pillow and Polk. Johnston doesn't have many resources, and he'll set up a defense line that is not the most tenable. He'll anchor his right flank on Cumberland Gap, his center on Bowling Green, and guarding the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers were two forts that were sited and located by the Confederates when Kentucky was neutral. The problem is, as you know, the north boundary of Kentucky, the north boundary of Tennessee and the south boundary of Kentucky is not a straight line. When it reaches the Cumberland River, it drops north about a mile, goes across the land known as Between the Lakes, and strikes the Tennessee River. And it goes south on the Tennessee River to about where that bridge that carries you across Kentucky Lake on Highway 72. And the high ground is on the other side. And on the Tennessee side of the river if you look at the trees, when Gilbert goes there, he can see flood marks, just like you have that seawall there, and all of you people who've lived here during the various floods can tell you where high water is. But the Confederate engineers had not paid any attention to high water marks on the trees. And they had located Fort Henry on the east side of the river, where, if it hadn't fallen on the 6th, the Confederates would have been flooded out of Fort Henry. Well, fast forward. The Union have created a Navy. Now, in April 1861, the Confederates are going to be in big trouble because there's a noted engineer. You're on the river here, James Buchanan Eads. He's the king of the salvors on the Mississippi River. And there's tributaries, the Red, the Arkansas. And he has powerful friends in Washington, the Blair brothers. Montgomery was the secretary who's the postmaster general, and Brother Frank, the Republican boss of Missouri. And he meets, Mr. Eads meets with President Lincoln, and the Secretary of War, Mr. Cameron. Now at that time, Lincoln's man at the Wigwam in Chicago was Judge David Davis. Lincoln had practiced before him on the 8th Circuit in Illinois. And he told Davis, cut no deals. But Davis, on the second ballot, after the second ballot, got nervous and told the Pennsylvania delegation, headed by a man that would be one of these guys that thinks you can't catch him for graft. Senator Cameron says to the Pennsylvania delegation, you switch your votes for Mr. Lincoln, Cameron will get in the cabinet. If you're going to get in the cabinet and the war's on, what job do you want? Secretary of War. That's where all the contracts are. And they're going to have a big argument there. Who is in charge of inland waterways? The Department of the Army, the War Department under Secretary Cameron, or the Navy Department under Gideon Wells, as Lincoln called him, Father Neptune, a Connecticut newspaper man. Wells will lose the argument, and Cameron will be in charge of the Brown Water Navy. He says, Brown Water Navy, that's close to the Army, so I'm in charge. And the Navy will contract with James B. Eads to build 7 ironclads. These people in the river know all about them. You'll also buy 2, 3 riverboats and convert them into timberclads. So the Federals, as we go into February, have a Navy on the inland waterways. The Confederates have none. And since the Navy is under the Army, flag officer, the flag officer will have to get cooperation of the Army. So they come with an expedition. And the expedition will leave Cairo, Illinois on the 4th day of February. as you all know, up the Tennessee River, up the Ohio River. They wave at C.F. Smith, whose division is remaining in occupation of your fair city of Paducah, and they arrive below Fort Henry on the fifth day of November. So they're going to have a the river is high. It's before the TVA, and the Tennessee River has notorious floods until the TVA, and they build the first dam down at Wheeler Dam at Muscle Shoals. And they are going to reconnoiter, and they're going to decide they're going to attack Fort Henry. Now, who's in charge of Fort Henry? Your local boy, General Tillman. The Confederates have also realized that now that Kentucky is no longer neutral, they have erected a fort opposite Fort Henry on the Kentucky side, on the Kentucky side, which was now with much of the purchase in Confederate occupation. So they're going to move against. Now they are going to decide. The Confederates decide we better concentrate everybody in Fort Donelson, and the Confederates are just going to make a holding action. So your local hero, General Tillman, with 70 men, will man the 11 guns in Fort Henry that bear on the river. And the Union gunboats, they're both going to cast off at 10 in the morning. Flag Officer Foote. Now, Flag Officer Foote, if you're in the Navy and he commands your ship, you better go to chapel, because he preaches chapel on Sunday. He's a strong Congregationalist. So he, with 4 ironclads and 3 timberclads, will cast off at 10 o'clock. He'll tell Grant the roads are muddy. You better start earlier in the morning. Grant is very cocksure that I will reach Fort Henry on the east side of the river with McClellan's division, and C.F. Smith will reach Fort Heiman on the other side of the river long before the gunboats. Well, he's all wet. The gunboats will come and engage at 10, 11 o'clock, and by 12 o'clock, even though Tillman has pulled off his blouse, mounting on the firing step, firing back, the Cincinnati, flagship of foot, closes within a quarter of a mile, and Fort Henry surrenders. So Grant has a victory, won for him by his brown water navy. Grant, in reporting it, is very cocky. He will tell the administration, we have captured Fort Henry, and tomorrow we move against Fort Donelson. But the roads are bad. He will send his timberclads up the Tennessee River all the way to Florence, Alabama. That causes consternation on all the towns located on the Tennessee River, both in Tennessee, northeast Mississippi, and in Alabama as far as Florence, Alabama. Foote will have to send his gunboats, all except Carondelet, will have to be sent back to Cairo for repairs. And it's going to be the 11th. Grant isn't as good as he said he was going to do. He said if he had kept his timetable, he would have moved against Fort Donelson on the 8th. But he's going to get even more out of it, it'll be, so he's lucky. Because General Johnston has decided to throw all his available troops into Fort Donelson. He's going to give up Bowling Green, retreat all the way to Nashville. Donelson better hold, or the capital of Tennessee will be the first of the 11 Confederate states' capital that will fall into those terrible Yankee hands. Already the Confederates have run into a disaster out in western Kentucky at Mill Springs on the 19th of January. So the Confederates start arriving in Fort Donelson. By the evening of the 13th, the Confederates will have 17,000 men in Fort Donelson. If you've been to Fort Donelson, you've been to the water batteries. Unlike the ones at Fort Henry, these are well above the river. And if you're going to be the Navy, to move against them, you're going to have to take fire from the front. And the Confederates have some trouble with commanders. Poor General Tillman is en route to Fort Warren in Boston, so he isn't available anymore. So the Confederate commanders are going to be this at Fort Donelson. The senior officer at Fort Donelson, who arrives on the 13th, is John B. Floyd. A reason that Virginia is glad governors only serve one-year terms. Arguably one of the poor governors of Virginia. In fact, he'd been governor of Virginia during the Nat Turner Uprising in 1831. And he is the ranking officer. The number 2 ranking officer will be Gideon Pillow. Now, Gideon Pillow was a friend. He is not a law partner of President James Knox Polk, but he was a friend of his and had served in the Mexican War and had not done very well. But he was a good organizer, so he'll be the 2nd highest ranking Confederate general at Fort Donelson. The lowest ranking one, and the only West Pointer, is Grant's old friend from West Point, the man who would lend him enough money when he's dead broke in New York City to get back to St. Louis County, where his wife and his 2 children live. Grant now has 4 children. So they're going to move against him. The only Confederate that's going to distinguish himself is the one that's wearing this T-shirt there, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Maybe it wouldn't have been a disaster that it will be. So the Union move out, moving along 2 roads which still exist. 12 miles they've got to go from Fort Henry to Fort Donelson. On the 12th, they close into Fort Donelson and begin investing that perimeter, which is 3 miles around. You have the fort, which is very obvious. Then you have the 2 water batteries, and then enclosing the water batteries in the fort is a perimeter of earthworks 3 miles in length. The Union closed in on the 12th. By that time, Forrest had arrived from up in Kentucky and gives the Confederates, and gives the Union advance some problems. Now the weather is unusually spring-like. On February, the period between February 6th and February 16th is until February 13th is spring-like. Just the opposite was in February here. It was as lousy as it was in Washington. And already the leaves the flowering shrubs are blooming just like they are today. This is in the 2nd week of February. The Union troops are too bright. They throw away their blankets and their overcoats because they're going to find on the 14th a cold front's going to come in, and the weather is going to drop from in the 60s to 20 above. And it ain't going to be a pleasant night for either the Confederates or the Yankees on the 14th. Well, by the 14th, Foote is back. He's back with, he now has 4 ironclads, the same as he had at Fort Henry. He doesn't have Essex anymore because it had gotten beaten up too bad to come back. So he has the 4 ironclads. He has Louisville, if you have favorite vessels, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, and Carondelet, and he only has 2 of his timberclads, Lexington and Tyler. He brings 6,000 more troops. So Grant now has 23,000 men, the Confederates 18,000. And the Navy is cocky. They don't know that the Confederates now have plunging fire on them. And on the 18th, with ice on the rigging, the gunboats go off and set up the river to engage the guns in the water battery, 8 32-pounders and 1 10-inch Columbian, and the 3 guns in the upper battery. They'll close to within a quarter of a mile. At that time, even you, since I made you Colonel Forrest, Forrest is so certain it's going to end up just like Henry. Then he turns to the fighting preacher, a good Presbyterian who can call down the Lord's wrath on him. And he says, "Pray for us, Major Kelly, because only Lord can help us now." But the Confederates are standing tall. The men manning the 7 32-pounders in the lower battery, one had been knocked out, and the Columbia give the Yankee Navy more than they want. Now, if the Tennessee flowed the other way, the Confederates would have caught them 4 ironclads. But they drift downstream where the Yankees are out of action. And the Confederates make their plans for the 15th. Now, Grant has a lot of problems now. The Navy, which had carried the ball at Henry, has failed. They leave 1 gunboat behind, Louisville, and the rest of them go back to Cairo to make repairs. Now, Grant, on the morning of the 15th, decides he has to go and meet with Foote. Foote is anchored with the vessels 4 miles down the Cumberland. And he tells his men, don't bring on an engagement. It was a miserable night, again on the night of the 14th and the 15th. And the Confederates have decided to break out, attack the Confederate right, roll it back, open the way to Charlotte, which will take them on to Nashville, and they've extracted their army. And they start off well, because Grant is off talking to Foote 4 miles away. The officers there, whether it's C.F. Smith, Lew Wallace, who has now joined him, or McClellan, are now being attacked. And it looks like things are going to come on. It looks like you're going to get rid of this guy, and you won't have to deal with him at Appomattox Courthouse. That's how desperate the thing is going to be by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. McClellan's 3 brigades are broken and fall back. Wallace will say that Lew Wallace, who writes Ben-Hur on government time, I want to emphasize Ben-Hur is territorial governor of New Mexico, writes Ben-Hur, the biggest selling novel of the 19th century, on government time and using government paper and forgetting about the Lincoln County War in which Billy the Kid there, and he fortunately commits his division, and they move to support McClellan. Grant now hurries back. It's not a pleasant ride back, because he sees lots of scared Yankee soldiers coming toward him. And when he comes to the Union left, he tells C.F. Smith, alerts him, I'm going over to visit my right, which is collapsing, and have your men ready to advance if I order it. He rides over to the right, and he notices the Confederates seem to be planning to leave the area. The Confederates have so General Floyd is one of these people that can't make a decision. He's a superior officer. When he talks to Pillow, and Pillow would say, let's go back into Donelson, pick up our men in Donelson, and go. And Floyd said, I think that's a good idea. Buckner will say, no, we got the enemy on the ropes. We've got them down for the count of 9. Let's continue our attack. Floyd says, good idea. So he goes back and forth twice, and finally decides to order everyone back. So they pull back in, C.F. Smith attacks, and gains a key position commanding the water battery. Now the Confederates, we've got to see what type of gonads the Confederate leadership has. They're going to meet in the Dover Hotel. The people there will be General Floyd, the ranking man. There'll be General Buckner, number 2, and General Buckner. Forrest is attending the meeting, and he says, I don't think the enemy have occupied all their trenches on our left. If you pick the Confederates, their back is to the Tennessee River, so their left would be the left flank on Lick Creek, on the road that leads to Charlotte and on to Nashville. He says, I'll go out and reconnoiter. And they're talking away, and Floyd is going to say, well, I think time has run out for us, and I'm the most hated Confederate. And a governor of Virginia, and I cannot surrender my men. But I want to go out. He turns to Pillow. Pillow says, I'm the second most hated Confederate. And he then turns to Buckner. Will you take command and let me escape? He's already, as they passed it down, Floyd had said to Pillow, will you take command? And he said, and Pillow says, yes, provided I can take my men out. So it goes to Buckner, and Buckner says, well, I assume command. Forrest returned, and he goes into his typical rage at these cowardly people there, particularly Floyd and Buckner, Floyd and Pillow, and he says, I don't care what you're doing, I'm taking my men out, and any men that want to go with me can go with me. And that's what he will do. They'll take the men, now remember, it's 10, 20 degrees above zero. So that means Lick Creek is pretty damn cold, and the water is saddle skirt deep. But he does go out and he escapes. Floyd, two steamboats come down river carrying reinforcements, boys from the 26th Mississippi. He gets them off the boat, leaves them there, loads his four Virginia regiments aboard the two steamboats, and the last they see him, he's standing on the fantail of one of the transports, shouting, come on, my brave Virginians, as they head for Nashville as fast as they can. Floyd, Pillow takes his staff, gets in a flatboat, they row him across the river in a flatboat, and they head for Nashville following the road by way of Clarksville on the north side of Donelson. So Buckner is left with about 15,000 men, and he's going to get the privilege of surrendering them. Now, no large number of Confederates have yet surrendered in the war, and there's considerable worry, particularly a man who has been educated at West Point. What will they decide to prosecute him as a traitor or not? So Buckner thinks it over, calls in his staff officer, and he draft a message addressed to General Grant. He knows he's fighting against Grant, and he says he announces that because of the dereliction of Floyd and Pillow, he's been left in command. With the Union in key positions, he would like to know what terms under which he can surrender the Fort Donelson garrison. It reaches Grant. Now remember, Grant had stuck. It shows you can be lucky. He had not fought the decision of the West Point entering as a cadet as Ulysses Simpson Grant, because his real name was Hiram Ulysses Grant, and the reason he fought it was because his clothes would have been stenciled HUG. So he will draft a message for Buckner. He knows him well. He knows well that Buckner had loaned him money to get home. And he says, I regret no terms can be My only terms are unconditional surrender, or I move immediately on their works. You can imagine Buckner getting that message. He'll say, the message back, the situation is such that I have to accept your ungentlemanly terms. So Grant will become a big hero. He'll win the first great victory the Union has won. He'll capture 13,000 Confederates. He'll capture 60-some pieces of artillery, and has the initiative. And with Donelson in Union hands, General Johnston has to give up Bowling Green. He has to give up Nashville. You, as Forrest, get to be the last man out of Nashville. And when the mobs are rioting, breaking into warehouses, you're being the fighting man you are, you'll break out the 2 new steam engines that the fire department of Nashville has gotten, and you'll spray the rioters with the water, and that disperses them, and you get out safe with your men. Well, the thing that happens now, somebody had said, one of the newspaper correspondents had said that Grant likes cigars. And I'm surprised the anti-smoking people haven't grabbed onto this. Grant was a cigarette smoker. He had never been a cigar smoker before. And being rather tight with a buck, he literally gets hundreds of boxes of cigars. And he will become a dedicated cigar smoker. At the Battle of the Wilderness, on the 5th day of May of '64, when he's now General-in-Chief of the Army, things are not going well. And his Chief of Staff counts Grant's cigars. Whether he's smoking them or chewing them, he goes through 26 cigars in a very harrowing day. Grant will go on to Shiloh, the road will lead him to Vicksburg, to Missionary Ridge, and with Lincoln facing an election in 1864, Congress will pass a bill establishing the rank of Lieutenant General, an office that no American soldier had held. Scott was only a brevet Lieutenant General. The last man to be a Lieutenant General in the United States Army was George Washington. You're going to say, he was a general. Yes, he was a general in the Continental Army. But we're facing an undeclared war with France, and when Washington leaves the White House on the 4th day of March, 1798, he becomes a Lieutenant General of the Army and would have commanded our army if the undeclared war with France had ended into a declared war. So they revived that, and Grant will become General-in-Chief of the Army. His mission will be, his mission is, he tells Sherman, you'll be charged in the West. You will move your army deep into Georgia, break up the Confederate army there, and Meade's orders will be, where Meade goes, you will go. Grant will go on to Appomattox Courthouse, 2-term President of the United States, and in 1886, he's diagnosed with cancer of the throat. And he'll write his memoirs, 2 volumes. They're probably the best military memoirs written by any man since Julius Caesar. He'll complete his memoirs on July 10th, 1886. 6 days later, he's dead of cancer of the throat. So that's the story of Grant's, rather brief, of Grant's from the time he got off the boat here on the morning of the 6th of September of 1861. Now, the last Sherman, one time after the Grant is dead. Sherman is a motor mouth. And they'll say, and all newspaper correspondents have a pretense of asking stupid questions. A newspaper man asked Sherman, who's a better general, you or General Grant? I can just see the newspaper man's eyes lighting up. Grant is dead. And he says, well, I'm smarter than Grant. I know logistics. I know strategy better than Grant. But the thing I said first when I talked Grant, moral courage. But he says he doesn't worry about the enemy. And I sure as hell do. For instance, on the night of the 6th day of April, this is when, if you're going to get rid of General Grant on your military ability, you are going to get rid of him. Because Johnston has been mortally wounded that day. And when Grant meets with Sherman and McPherson, they both recommend Grant fall back. And Grant will tell one of them, they beat us today, we'll beat them tomorrow. What does he do on the 7th? And he says tomorrow to the other one, he says tomorrow we'll sleep in our camps where the Confederates are sleeping now. So that's what Sherman is meaning there. And Sherman will also say, Grant stuck by me when they said I was crazy, and I stuck by him when they said he was a drunk. So that does my story of Grant.